coal mine in northern Colombia is not where anyone expects to find one of the largest predators that ever lived. Yet in 2004, while studying fossils exposed by mining operations, researchers came across a bone that seemed out of place. At first glance, it looked like it belonged to a crocodile. It didn't. The vertebra was wider than a person's hand, far too large for any snake alive today. Yet that is exactly what it came from. The largest snake on Earth now, the green anaconda, averages around 5 meters long. The animal that left this bone behind stretched at least 13 meters and weighed more than 1,100 kilograms. At its widest point, it would have reached your hip, and it lived only 6 million years after the dinosaurs disappeared. That alone would make Titanoboa remarkable. But the real mystery is not its size. It is how a cold blooded animal managed to reach that size at all. Everything we know about living reptiles suggests there should be limits, hard limits, mathematical limits. Yet somehow, Titanoboa pushed far beyond them. Its fossils revealed something unexpected about the ancient Earth. Some scientists believe they contain clues about temperatures unlike anything found in the modern tropics. Others argue the evidence has been misunderstood from the very beginning. Its skull told a different story than researchers expected. The giant predator imagined by popular culture may not have been the animal the evidence actually describes, and the world that produced Titanoboa did not last. Within a few million years, the conditions that allowed it to exist disappeared, and the snake vanished with them. Today, we travel back to a rainforest unlike anything alive today to understand why one of the largest snakes ever discovered may have been impossible. Before we do, if you enjoy content like this, hit the like button and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, is it late where you are right now? Or are you starting your day with this? Now, let's step into the world that made Titanoboa possible. For a brief moment in geological history, the future belonged to almost no one. Approximately 66 million years ago, an asteroid between 10 and 15 kilometers wide struck the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula. It arrived at roughly 20 kilometers per second, faster than any animal had ever moved, carrying enough energy to alter the course of life across the entire planet. Rock vaporized, shock waves spread through the crust, debris climbed into the atmosphere and remained there long enough to change the conditions on which ecosystems depended. The extinction that followed removed roughly 75% of species from Earth within a comparatively short span of geological time. Familiar rulers of the late Cretaceous disappeared. Non-avian dinosaurs vanished from the continents. Giant marine reptiles vanished from the oceans. Pterosaurs vanished from the sky. Entire ecological structures that had persisted for millions of years were dismantled and scattered. Yet survival often favors the overlooked. Among the creatures that endured were small mammals, many no larger than modern shrews. Crocodilians persisted in waterways. Turtles remained in lakes and wetlands. Snakes survived as well, slipping through the extinction without attracting much attention. At this stage of their history, they were modest animals occupying limited roles. For tens of millions of years, they had existed alongside larger and more dominant creatures, rarely becoming major players in the broader story of life. What mattered most was not merely what vanished, but what was left behind. Across the world, ecological vacancies appeared. The highest predatory positions in countless ecosystems no longer had occupants. There was no Tyrannosaurus, no giant marine hunter equivalent to a mosasaur. Entire layers of biological competition simply ceased to exist. Food webs remained, but many of their largest pieces had been removed. As Earth entered the Paleocene epoch, spanning approximately 66 to 56 million years ago, South America occupied a unique position. The continent stood apart from North America, separated by broad marine barriers and lacking any permanent land connection. Animals evolving there did so largely in isolation, without regular arrivals from neighboring continents. Evolution in this setting became a local conversation. Far to the north of the continent, the region that would eventually become Colombia was taking shape. Vast coastal floodplains stretched across low terrain. Rivers wandered slowly through the landscape, dividing and reconnecting across enormous wetlands. Moisture accumulated continuously. Vegetation expanded rapidly. Temperatures remained exceptionally high, beyond the range experienced by any modern tropical ecosystem. Life responded with remarkable speed. Plants flourished, animal populations diversified, ecological networks became increasingly dense and productive. The aftermath of the extinction faded into the distant background as new communities established themselves across the warming landscape. Millions of years passed. Generation followed generation, each shaped by the unusual conditions of this isolated continent. No large mammalian carnivores arrived from elsewhere. No outside predator entered to claim the vacant upper tiers of the food web. The opportunities created by extinction remained available, waiting to be occupied. Beneath the dense greenery, beside slow waterways, and across a world running hotter than the modern Earth, a lineage that had once survived by remaining small began moving steadily in another direction. Something was growing. The discovery began in a place built to erase the past. In the arid landscapes of La Guajira, northern Colombia, enormous machines cut through layer after layer of ancient rock. The Serrahun coal mine, one of the largest open pit coal mines on Earth, operates on an almost unimaginable scale. Trucks move through excavated terraces. Conveyor belts carry black seams of carbon toward processing facilities. Yet hidden within those seams is something far older than the mine itself. The coal extracted from Serrahun is not simply fuel. It is compressed plant matter from a rainforest that lived approximately 60 million years ago. Leaves, trunks, roots, and spores accumulated in wetlands were buried, compressed, and transformed over immense spans of time. Together, they preserve the oldest known neotropical rainforest in the fossil record. The landscape being mined today is the physical remains of an ecosystem that vanished tens of millions of years before humans appeared. In 2004, during a geological field visit to the site, a student noticed unusual fossils embedded within sandstone slabs. At first, most of the material seemed familiar. Fossilized plants emerged regularly from the formation. Fragments of ancient vegetation had become expected discoveries, but mixed among them were remains that belonged to animals. The discoveries accumulated gradually. Giant turtle shells appeared. Lungfish remains emerged from the rock, representing animals that could reach nearly 3 meters in length. Fossils from crocodile relatives surfaced as well. Then researchers encountered a vertebra unlike anything they had seen before. The bone was eventually sent to Jonathan Block, a vertebrate paleontologist at the University of Florida. He immediately recognized its identity. It belonged to a snake. The problem was its size. Nothing living matched the dimensions suggested by the fossil. The vertebra was so large that ordinary comparisons failed. If the identification was correct, the animal responsible existed far outside the range of known snakes. Rather than solving a mystery, the identification created a larger one. Block joined forces with Smithsonian paleobotanist Carlos Jeremizi, and together they organized a series of international expeditions back to Serrahun. What followed transformed an unusual fossil into one of the most important vertebrate discoveries of the century. Year after year, additional remains emerged from the formation. Researchers recovered trunk vertebrae, ribs, and eventually fragments of skull material. By 2009, fossils representing approximately 28 individual animals had been documented from the same geological unit. The evidence no longer pointed to a single extraordinary specimen. It pointed to a real population inhabiting a real ecosystem. The animal received the name Titanoboa cerahonensis, the Titanic boa from Cerrahon. When the formal description appeared in the journal Nature in February 2009, the announcement carried two revelations at once. The paper introduced the largest snake ever discovered in the fossil record. At the same time, it proposed something even broader. The size of the animal, the researchers argued, contained information about the climate of the ancient world itself. A snake had become a measurement, and the number hidden within its bones was far larger than many climate scientists expected. A measurement on paper rarely feels extraordinary. A number sits quietly on a page, detached from weight, distance, and presence. Titanoboa's dimensions begin that way as well, as figures in scientific papers and museum reports. Only when those figures are translated back into a living animal does their meaning become difficult to ignore. The most conservative estimates place Titanoboa between 12.8 and 14.3 meters in length. Subsequent modeling performed for Smithsonian reconstructions pushed some individuals closer to 14.6 meters, a figure commonly rounded to 15 meters in later discussions. Even the lower end of that range places the animal far beyond anything alive today. Mass introduces another layer of scale. Depending on which specimen and methodology are used, estimates range from approximately 730 kilograms to more than 1,135 kilograms. Calculations based on modern anaconda reproduction suggest that exceptionally large pregnant females may have approached 1,465 kilograms. At that point, the snake enters a category occupied not by reptiles, but by large terrestrial mammals. Its width alters the picture further. The most striking dimension was not found at the head. It occurred midway along the body, where muscle and internal organs reached their greatest volume. At this widest point, the body of the snake would have risen roughly to the hip of an average adult human. Standing beside it, a person would not be confronted with a thin ribbon of scales, but with a living structure comparable in thickness to their own torso. The spine behind that body was immense. Researchers estimate more than 250 vertebrae, although a complete skeleton has never been recovered. What makes the estimate persuasive is consistency. Vertebrae from multiple individuals scale in remarkably similar ways. The extraordinary size does not appear restricted to rare giants. It appears to have been typical of mature adults. Comparison with living snakes highlights the gap. The heaviest reliably documented Burmese python weighed approximately 183 kilograms. Titanoboa exceeded that by roughly a factor of 6. The longest verified living snake, a reticulated python measuring 9.6 meters, still falls more than 3 meters short of Titanoboa's minimum estimates. That difference alone exceeds the height of an adult male giraffe. Even among fossil snakes, Titanoboa stands apart. Before its discovery, the record belonged to Gigantophis garstini, a giant serpent from Eocene Egypt. Titanoboa surpassed it by a margin greater than the entire length of a modern king cobra. The previous champion did not merely lose the record, the scale of comparison itself changed. Museum replicas reveal another aspect that measurements cannot fully capture. Visitors standing beside full-size reconstructions often describe an unusual sense of proportion. The animal does not simply appear large, it appears incompatible with familiar expectations. Every dimension seems stretched beyond the limits established by living reptiles, and yet the fossils leave little room for doubt. The numbers remain consistent across specimens, across institutions, and across years of analysis. The challenge is no longer determining whether Titanoboa reached these dimensions. The challenge is understanding how a cold blooded animal reached them at all. Some biological limits are written not in bones but in temperature. A mammal carries a furnace inside its body. A bird does as well. Their organs generate heat continuously, allowing muscles, nerves, circulation, and digestion to operate within a relatively stable internal environment. A snake lives by a different arrangement. It borrows energy from the world around it. Titanoboa belonged to a group of animals known as ectotherms. Like modern snakes, crocodilians, and most reptiles, it did not maintain its own constant body temperature through internal heat production. Every major process within its body depended on environmental warmth. Digestion accelerated when temperatures rose, muscle performance improved, circulation became more efficient, even the chemistry unfolding within individual cells proceeded at rates closely tied to surrounding conditions. This dependence creates a relationship that biologists can measure. As an ectotherm becomes larger, its body demands greater quantities of energy to sustain movement, growth, tissue maintenance, and reproduction. Yet the metabolic machinery supporting those demands remains linked to external heat. The larger the animal becomes, the more difficult it becomes for environmental energy alone to support its increasing biological needs. Eventually, a ceiling emerges. This ceiling is not an abstract idea. It appears repeatedly across living ectotherms. Scientists can observe it through measurable relationships between body mass, metabolic rate, growth, and ambient temperature. The details vary among species, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. Heat places boundaries around size. That pattern is visible in the modern tropics. The largest living snakes occur in the warmest sustained environments on Earth: the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, and the tropical forests of Southeast Asia provide conditions that allow reptiles to reach dimensions impossible in colder climates. Even there, however, the numbers stabilize within a familiar range. The longest verified living snake measured approximately 9.6 meters. Reliable mass estimates for the largest living species cluster around 250 kilograms. These figures already represent the extreme upper edge of modern snake biology. They occupy the outer limits of what contemporary tropical ecosystems appear capable of supporting. Titanoboa existed far beyond that boundary. At more than 13 meters in length and over 1,100 kilograms in mass, it did not exceed the modern ceiling by a narrow margin. It surpassed it so dramatically that the comparison begins to lose meaning. The gap separating Titanoboa from the largest living snakes is not the difference between large and slightly larger. It is the difference between categories. The fossils leave little room for argument. Multiple individuals preserve the same extraordinary proportions. The animal existed. The dimensions are real. The challenge lies elsewhere. By the time researchers published their findings in 2009, attention had shifted from anatomy to physiology. If a snake of this size truly lived and functioned as a healthy population, then the environment supporting it must also have been real. The question became surprisingly precise. What level of sustained warmth would be necessary for an ectothermic animal of this mass to remain biologically viable? Scientists approached the problem through calculation rather than speculation. The results suggested a world very different from the one we know today. The calculation began with a surprisingly simple idea. A living animal carries information about the world that produced it. Sometimes that information is hidden in teeth, sometimes in growth rings, sometimes in chemistry. In the case of Titanoboa, it was hidden in size. Modern tropical snakes provide an enormous body of data. Across thousands of measured individuals from different species and environments, researchers have documented a consistent pattern. In warmer regions, snakes tend to reach larger maximum sizes. In cooler regions, growth is constrained. The relationship is not perfect because life rarely follows a single rule, but it is strong enough to appear again and again across tropical ecosystems. That pattern allowed scientists to approach Titanoboa from an unusual direction. Instead of asking how large a snake could become in a known climate, they reversed the equation. They began with the dimensions preserved in fossil bone and worked backward toward the environmental conditions required to support them. The approach is known as a paleothermometer. Rather than measuring ancient temperature directly, it estimates temperature through biological evidence. If the relationship between heat and body size is understood in living animals, then the size of a fossil organism can be used to infer the climate in which it lived. When researchers applied that method to Titanoboa, the results stood well beyond modern experience. Using a body mass of approximately 1,135 kilograms, they calculated that the snake would have required a mean annual temperature between 30 and 34 degrees Celsius to maintain a viable metabolism. Converted into Fahrenheit, that range corresponds to approximately 86 to 93 degrees. The significance becomes clearer when compared with the present day. The Caribbean coast of Colombia is already one of the hottest inhabited regions in South America, with average annual temperatures near 28 degrees Celsius. Titanoboa's environment appears to have operated above that level continuously. Even modern tropical rainforests, the warmest functioning terrestrial ecosystems on Earth, generally maintain annual averages between 26 and 28 degrees Celsius. According to the calculations derived from Titanoboa, the Paleocene landscape exceeded those values by roughly 3 to 4 degrees. On a human scale, a difference of a few degrees may seem minor. On a planetary scale, sustained temperature shifts of that magnitude separate entire climate regimes. They influence rainfall, vegetation, metabolism, and the boundaries within which ecosystems can function. What emerged from the analysis was an unsettling conclusion. There is no modern tropical environment that consistently reaches the minimum temperatures suggested by Titanoboa's size. The climate that produced the animal is not merely distant in time, it no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Lead researcher Jason Head described the fossil as a giant thermometer. The phrase captures the elegance of the idea. Preserved within ancient coal deposits was not only evidence of a snake, but evidence of atmospheric conditions from 60 million years ago. Other sources of information pointed in the same direction. Ocean sediment cores, fossilized leaf characteristics, and chemical signatures preserved in ancient soils all indicate elevated temperatures during the same period. Independent lines of evidence converged on a remarkably similar picture. Titanoboa is not difficult to explain because it was enormous. It is difficult to explain because the world required to build an animal of that size has vanished, and the distance between that world and ours can be measured in degrees. Imagine not a hotter version of the modern tropics, but a different climatic state altogether. Approximately 60 million years ago, the Cerrejón Basin occupied a sheltered corner of northern South America. To the north lay the waters of the young Proto-Caribbean Sea. Low uplands rose gradually to the east and west, helping trap moisture and maintain remarkable climatic stability. The result was a vast wetland system existing beneath conditions that remained warm with unusual consistency throughout the year. Temperature alone was not the defining feature. Stability mattered just as much. Modern tropical environments experience fluctuations. Seasons shift subtly. Rainfall patterns move. Cooler nights interrupt the accumulation of heat. In the Paleocene Cerrejón ecosystem, evidence suggests that seasonal variation was minimal. Warmth persisted month after month, with little interruption. For large ectotherms, this continuity was profoundly important. Biological processes never faced the repeated slowdowns imposed by seasonal cooling. Growth, digestion, and activity could continue under nearly constant thermal conditions. Rainfall was equally persistent. Water moved through the landscape continuously, feeding wetlands, channels, ponds, and broad river systems. The fossil plant record preserved at Cerrejón reveals one of the most complete windows into an early tropical rainforest ever discovered. Aquatic ferns flourished across flooded environments. Salvinia and related plants spread across quiet waters. Dense vegetation formed multiple canopy layers, creating an intricate three-dimensional habitat extending from submerged roots to sunlit treetops. The rivers threading through this landscape differed from those familiar today. They were broad, slow-moving, and heavily stained by organic material. Fallen leaves, decaying vegetation, and plant-rich sediments darkened the water. These waterways absorbed solar energy efficiently and retained warmth for long periods, functioning almost like vast reservoirs of stored heat. Their temperatures likely remained elevated day and night, providing ideal conditions for large aquatic ectotherms. The animals inhabiting these waterways reflected the abundance surrounding them. Cerrejonasuchus improcerus, a small relative of later crocodilians, moved through the wetlands at lengths of roughly 6 to 7 feet. Giant turtles occupied ponds and channels. Lungfish reached lengths approaching 3 meters. Large osteoglossomorph fish cruised beneath the surface. Primitive mammals remained present but relatively inconspicuous, sharing the environment with birds and numerous smaller vertebrates. One absence stands out among all the life that filled the basin. No large mammalian carnivores occupied South America at this time. None had yet evolved into the dominant predatory forms that would characterize later ages. The highest terrestrial predatory niches remained largely vacant. The extinction that had removed the great reptilian rulers millions of years earlier still echoed through the structure of the ecosystem. Yet this was not a damaged world recovering from catastrophe. The forests were mature, the rivers were productive, food webs operated with extraordinary complexity. Energy flowed through the ecosystem in immense quantities. Life filled nearly every available space. What existed in Cerrejón was not an ancient Amazon. The comparison is tempting because no modern landscape comes closer, yet even the Amazon represents a cooler, more restrained version of tropical life. Paleocene Colombia belonged to a climatic regime without a living counterpart, a world whose warmth, stability, and productivity exceeded anything present on Earth today. Fossils rarely preserve an entire animal. More often, they leave scattered fragments, pieces of a structure that must be reconstructed patiently, one bone at a time. Titanoboa is known in much the same way. No complete skeleton has ever emerged from the rock, yet the bones that have been recovered reveal far more than their incompleteness might suggest. The vertebrae provide the clearest starting point. They are unmistakably buoyed in structure, placing Titanoboa within the same broader family as modern boas rather than pythons. Each vertebra served as an anchor for powerful lateral muscles extending along the body. In snakes, These muscles generate the force responsible for locomotion and constriction. When multiplied across more than 13 meters of length, the architecture suggests an animal capable of distributing immense mechanical power through hundreds of interconnected segments. The ribs add another layer to the picture. They are robust and widely spaced, supporting a body built not for speed across open ground, but for carrying substantial mass. Their proportions resemble those seen in heavily aquatic snakes, where buoyancy reduces the burden placed upon the skeleton. Rather than fighting gravity continuously, much of Titanoboa's weight would have been supported by the surrounding water. Soft tissues did not survive, leaving coloration beyond direct observation. Scientists can only infer appearance through comparison with living relatives. The most plausible reconstruction suggests shades of brownish gray or dark olive. Such colors would blend naturally into muddy shorelines, shaded backwaters, and sediment-rich channels where visibility was limited and outlines dissolved into the surrounding landscape. The body itself was not a simple cylinder. Modern anacondas provide a useful anatomical comparison. Their cross-section is slightly flattened, forming an oval shape that improves aquatic movement. Titanoboa likely possessed a similar design. At maximum width, the body approached the dimensions of a human torso, creating a broad muscular surface optimized for pushing against water rather than lifting itself repeatedly across dry terrain. Its vertebral count appears unusually high. Researchers estimate more than 250 vertebrae, compared with roughly 200 in a green anaconda. Additional segments would have increased flexibility and provided finer muscular control along the body's length. Instead of functioning as one enormous structure, the snake could coordinate movement across hundreds of smaller units working together. Movement on land was almost certainly possible, but probably inefficient. A body weighing over 1,000 kilograms generates substantial friction when pressed against the ground. Sustained terrestrial travel would have required considerable energy. In water, however, those limitations changed dramatically. Buoyancy offset mass. The immense body became easier to maneuver. Constraints imposed by gravity faded, allowing the animal to move with a degree of efficiency impossible on land. The anatomy also hints at reproduction. As a member of the boa lineage, Titanoboa almost certainly gave birth to live young, rather than laying eggs. Developing offspring would have been carried internally within a body already operating at extraordinary scale. For years, most of these conclusions came from vertebrae and ribs alone. Then additional expeditions recovered something rarer. Fragments of the skull emerged from the formation, and when researchers finally examined them closely, the image they had built of Titanoboa began to change. For years, the image seemed obvious. Take the largest snake ever discovered, place it in a rainforest filled with crocodilians, turtles, and primitive mammals, and a familiar picture emerges almost automatically. A gigantic constrictor waits near muddy banks, hidden among vegetation, launching explosive attacks against any animal careless enough to approach the water's edge. It is the role played by large snakes today, merely enlarged to a scale the modern world no longer permits. The skull had other ideas. When additional fossil material from Sierra Leone was recovered and examined in detail, researchers found anatomical clues that did not fit the expected pattern. The proportions and arrangement of several cranial structures differed from what would be expected in a giant terrestrial ambush predator. The differences were subtle, hidden within joints and attachment points, but together they pointed toward a very different lifestyle. The positions of the tooth sockets along the palate and jaw margins were unusually elevated. The quadrate bone, which helps determine jaw movement, sat at a lower angle than expected. Portions of the palatine and pterygoid complex, structures involved in prey handling and swallowing, were comparatively reduced. Individually, none of these features would have transformed the interpretation. Taken together, they formed a coherent pattern. That pattern resembled an animal adapted primarily for capturing fish. Among living and extinct members of the boa family, this is extraordinary. Boas are generally associated with terrestrial or semi-aquatic hunting strategies focused on vertebrate prey captured through constriction. Titanoboa appears to have occupied a different ecological role altogether. It was not merely a larger version of a familiar predator. It may have represented an entirely unique experiment within Boyd evolution. The implications extend far beyond diet. If Titanoboa specialized in aquatic prey, then much of its life was likely spent beneath the surface. The warm waterways of Paleocene Colombia offered an environment where a massive body could move with far greater efficiency than on land. Instead of wading along shorelines, it may have drifted through deeper channels, navigating slowly through dark water rich with suspended organic matter. The surrounding ecosystem contained prey capable of supporting such a strategy. Lungfish from the Cerrejón Formation reached lengths approaching 3 meters. Large fish occupied the rivers in substantial numbers. In a habitat where warm temperatures accelerated biological productivity, aquatic food resources were abundant enough to sustain an animal of remarkable size. This interpretation does not exclude larger prey. Modern giant snakes occasionally consume crocodilians, and researchers have noted that Cerrejonosuchus, the small crocodile relative found in the same deposits, would have been vulnerable to an adult Titanoboa. Such encounters likely occurred when opportunity presented itself. Yet these animals appear less like primary targets and more like occasional additions to a diet centered on aquatic hunting. The resulting image differs dramatically from earlier assumptions. Not a giant constrictor dominating riverbanks, not a reptilian version of a terrestrial superpredator. Instead, an immense body suspended within slow-moving water, nearly balanced by buoyancy, advancing with minimal disturbance. Much of its presence would have remained invisible. A faint displacement of water, a subtle change in current, a movement detected only moments before it arrived. Predation at this scale becomes less a matter of behavior and more a matter of mechanics. Every movement made by Titanoboa was governed by physical forces operating through an animal that outweighed nearly everything around it. The familiar image of a snake strike still applies, but the numbers behind it enter a different category entirely. In snakes, strike performance depends more heavily on muscle mass than on total body length. A longer snake is not automatically a faster snake. What matters is the amount of force available to accelerate the head and neck forward. Titanoboa possessed an extraordinary amount of force. When a body weighing over 1,000 kilograms commits part of its muscular system to a strike, the resulting momentum becomes difficult to visualize through comparison with living species. No prey animal known from the Cerrejón ecosystem appears to have possessed the size or strength necessary to physically resist such an impact once contact occurred. The outcome would have been determined almost immediately. The same principle extends to constriction. Modern anacondas can exert pressures approaching 9 kilograms per square centimeter. Titanoboa carried several times the body mass and vastly greater overall muscle volume. Exact measurements are impossible, but scaling from living relatives suggests constriction forces capable of overwhelming any vertebrate sharing its environment. The struggle would not have been prolonged. Once coils were established, the mechanical advantage belonged entirely to the snake. Its feeding capacity was equally remarkable. Large modern snakes routinely consume prey, representing a substantial fraction of their own body weight. Applying similar proportions to Titanoboa suggests meals ranging from roughly 300 to 600 kilograms. A giant lungfish alone could represent a meaningful feeding event. Smaller crocodilian relatives inhabiting the same waterways would also have fallen comfortably within the range of manageable prey. Such enormous meals carried consequences. Digestion in snakes is among the most energy intensive processes found in vertebrate biology. Organs enlarge, metabolic activity rises dramatically. Internal systems shift into a temporary state focused almost entirely on processing food. For Titanoboa, this period may have lasted many days. Following a large meal, movement likely became minimal. The animal could remain concealed within warm waterways, allowing environmental heat to power the immense physiological work occurring inside its body. The thermal conditions of Paleocene Colombia made this strategy possible. Warm water functioned as an external energy source, sustaining digestion at a rate unattainable in cooler climates. The same meal, consumed under significantly lower temperatures, might have become biologically difficult to process. Hunting itself probably relied on senses other than vision. The rivers of Cerrejón were often dark and sediment rich. Visibility was limited. Although soft tissues are not preserved, many close relatives of boas possess sensory systems capable of detecting subtle environmental cues. Chemoreception, using the forked tongue to sample chemical traces suspended in water, likely played a central role. Thermal sensing may have contributed as well, allowing the snake to detect living animals even when they remained hidden from view. One uncertainty remains difficult to resolve. Fossils reveal that multiple adult Titanoboas occupied the same river system, yet behavior does not fossilize. Whether these animals tolerated one another passively or maintained overlapping territories remains unknown. What is clear is that survival at this scale required more than successful hunting. It required producing the next generation, and that challenge carried its own extraordinary demands. Every adult Titanoboa began as a newborn. That simple fact becomes surprisingly difficult to imagine once the scale of the animal is considered. The challenge is not understanding how a giant snake hunted or moved. The challenge is understanding how such a creature entered the world in the first place. As a member of the boa lineage, Titanoboa almost certainly did not lay eggs. Modern boas retain developing embryos within their bodies and give birth to live young. Fossil evidence cannot preserve the moment directly, but the evolutionary relationships are strong enough that paleontologists regard live birth as the most likely reproductive strategy. This creates an extraordinary biological situation. A female already operating near the upper limits of ectothermic body size would have carried developing offspring internally for months at a time. Estimates based on large living anacondas suggest that a pregnant Titanoboa may have reached approximately 1,465 kilograms in mass. Within the Cerrejón ecosystem, that would have made her the largest individual animal of any kind, while simultaneously placing the greatest metabolic demands upon her body. Modern large boas provide an important comparison. During pregnancy, females often lose between 30 and 40% of their body mass. The developing offspring represent an enormous energetic investment. If similar proportions applied to Titanoboa, a female beginning gestation at roughly 1,100 kilograms could emerge hundreds of kilograms lighter by the time reproduction was complete. Recovery would not have been optional. Following birth, a depleted female would have needed access to substantial prey resources almost immediately. The energy reserves consumed during gestation had to be rebuilt, and rebuilding them required successful hunting in an ecosystem capable of supplying food on an extraordinary scale. The duration of pregnancy remains unknown. Living boas generally carry developing young for 6 to 8 months, but Titanoboa existed beyond the size range of any modern analog. Greater mass often slows biological processes. It is possible that gestation extended longer, unfolding at a pace dictated by a metabolism already operating near its physiological limits. The number of offspring is equally uncertain. Modern boas can produce litters ranging from roughly 10 to 60 young. Titanoboa may have followed a similar pattern, though no direct evidence survives. Even at birth, however, the offspring would likely have been impressive animals by modern standards. Yet size alone did not guarantee safety. Juveniles occupied a different world than adults. Small crocodilian relatives moved through the same waterways. Large fish patrolled the channels. Predators capable of becoming prey later in life could have posed a serious threat during the earliest stages of development. The ecosystem that sustained adult Titanoboas was also capable of removing many young individuals before they reached maturity. Temperature influenced every part of the process. Female boas today often seek warmer locations during pregnancy, behavior thought to accelerate embryonic development. Applied to Titanoboa, the image becomes remarkable. An animal already living in one of the warmest, sustained climates Earth has known still benefiting from additional heat. The entire reproductive cycle rested upon environmental stability. Successful gestation depended on warmth. Recovery depended on prey abundance. Prey abundance depended on the productivity of the surrounding ecosystem. Each element supported the next, forming a chain held together by climate. For a time, that chain remained intact. The world provided exactly the conditions required. Growth continued, generation after generation, producing animals larger than any snake before or since. The rise of Titanoboa appears astonishing when viewed from the perspective of the finished animal. Viewed through evolution, however, it begins with something much smaller. In the aftermath of the extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs, snakes were survivors rather than rulers. Most occupied modest ecological roles. They hid underground, hunted small prey, and passed largely unnoticed through ecosystems dominated by larger creatures. Yet survival itself carried an advantage. The lineages that endured inherited a world filled with opportunities that had not existed before. Evolution rarely plans, it accumulates. Imagine a population in which some individuals grow slightly larger than average. Those larger animals gain access to bigger prey. Better nutrition supports improved survival. Individuals that survive longer often reproduce more successfully. Their descendants inherit the same tendency. Across thousands of generations, tiny differences compound. The average body size of the population begins drifting upward. Under ordinary circumstances, that process encounters limits. Predators impose risks. Competitors consume resources. Climate restricts metabolism. Growth slows when the costs of becoming larger outweigh the benefits. The Paleocene removed many of those constraints simultaneously. Temperatures remained elevated beyond anything seen in modern tropical ecosystems. For ectotherms, warmth expands biological possibilities. Higher sustained temperatures allow larger bodies to remain metabolically viable. Each incremental increase in environmental heat effectively raises the ceiling governing maximum size. At the same time, adult Titanoboas appear to have faced virtually no predation pressure. Among the fossils recovered from Cerrejón, the known individuals are fully grown animals. Nothing in the ecosystem possessed the combination of size, strength, and ecological position necessary to threaten a mature Titanoboa. Evolutionary pressure favoring smaller size largely disappeared. Geography amplified these conditions further. During this period, South America functioned as an isolated continent, separated from North America and evolving independently. In evolutionary terms, isolation often produces unusual outcomes. Biologists refer to a related pattern as the island rule, in which animals confined to isolated environments frequently evolve toward unexpected body sizes. Small species sometimes become larger. Large species sometimes become smaller. The absence of normal ecological interactions allows evolution to explore pathways that would otherwise remain closed. South America operated like an island on a continental scale. Prey species encountered relatively little pressure from large terrestrial predators. Resources remained abundant. Ecological communities developed within a system largely insulated from outside competitors. For a lineage already trending toward larger size, the environment offered room to continue expanding. Scientists describe this phenomenon as ecological release. Constraints that normally regulate body size become weakened or disappear altogether. Competition decreases, predation decreases, food remains plentiful, climate supports larger bodies. Evolution responds by moving toward a new equilibrium. What makes Titanoboa remarkable is not merely the endpoint, but the speed. Approximately 6 million years separates the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs from the appearance of Titanoboa. In geological terms, that interval is brief. The entire history of the human lineage occupies a comparable span. Within that same amount of time, a group of relatively small snakes produced the most massive serpent known from the fossil record. The result was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of environmental conditions aligning in an exceptionally rare way, opening a window of possibility wide enough for evolution to fill. For many years, Titanoboa occupied a category entirely by itself. It seemed to represent a singular event, an evolutionary outlier produced by an unusual combination of circumstances unlikely to occur again. The largest snake ever discovered stood alone in the fossil record, separated from every living species by a gap so large that comparison often felt inadequate. Then another set of vertebrae emerged from stone. In April of 2026, researchers announced the discovery of a giant fossil snake from the Pananthro lignite mine in Gujarat, western India. The animal was named Vasuki indicus, honoring Vasuki, the great serpent of Hindu tradition associated with the god Shiva. The name carried mythological weight, yet the fossil itself required no embellishment. The dimensions alone were enough. The remains date to approximately 47 million years ago, placing the animal within the Eocene epoch. Titanoboa had already disappeared by then, separated from Vasuki by millions of years. Yet both existed within the same broader chapter of Earth history, a time when global temperatures remained substantially warmer than those familiar today. The fossil material consists primarily of vertebrae recovered from lignite deposits. Like the coal-bearing formations of Cerrejón, the Panandro deposits preserve the compressed remains of ancient vegetation from a warm tropical ecosystem. Once again, a giant snake emerged from the fossilized remnants of a greenhouse world. Current estimates place Vasuki between approximately 11 and 15 meters in length. Some interpretations suggest that the upper end of its possible size range could approach 17 meters if future analyses support the largest projections. Should those estimates prove accurate, the animal may rival or even exceed Titanoboa in overall length. The precise ranking matters less than the broader implication. Titanoboa and Vasuki belong to different lineages, separated by geography and time. One evolved in South America, the other evolved in the Indian subcontinent. Thousands of kilometers lay between them. Millions of years lay between them, yet both moved toward nearly the same destination. This pattern is known as convergent evolution. When unrelated organisms encounter similar environmental pressures, evolution often produces comparable solutions. Wings evolved independently in birds, bats, and extinct pterosaurs. Streamlined bodies appeared repeatedly in marine predators. Giant snakes may represent another example of the same principle operating on a grand scale. The conditions shared by both worlds are striking. Sustained warmth elevated beyond modern tropical norms. Productive ecosystems capable of supporting enormous prey. Relative ecological isolation. Opportunities available at the top of food webs. Remove enough constraints, and body size begins expanding toward limits rarely seen under ordinary circumstances. Viewed through that lens, Titanoboa becomes something different from an anomaly. It was not a biological accident, it was the predictable expression of a particular environmental configuration. Given sufficient heat, sufficient resources, and sufficient time, evolution repeatedly explored the same region of possibility space. The discovery of Vasuki suggests that giant snakes were not unique events separated from the normal workings of evolution. They were recurring outcomes produced when the planet entered a specific state. Earth has generated that state before. It simply has not generated it for a very long time. The climatic conditions that once supported such animals belong to a vanished world whose rise and decline shaped everything that followed. The warmth that nurtured Titanoboa was not the hottest condition Earth would experience during that era. It was only part of a broader climatic story that was still unfolding, one that would eventually push the planet toward temperatures almost unimaginable by modern standards. Approximately 55.8 million years ago, several million years after Titanoboa flourished in the wetlands of northern South America, Earth entered an interval now known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, often abbreviated as the PETM. In geological records, it appears suddenly, like a sharp pulse written into stone. Something released an enormous quantity of carbon into the atmosphere, altering the chemistry of the planet and changing the balance of heat between Earth and space. The precise source remains debated. Some researchers point toward intense volcanic activity associated with the opening of the North Atlantic. Others suggest vast deposits of methane trapped beneath seafloor sediments became destabilized and escaped into the atmosphere. It may even have been a combination of several processes occurring together. Whatever the source, the result was unmistakable. Global temperatures rose by approximately 5 to 8 degrees Celsius over a span of roughly 20,000 years. To human history, 20,000 years seems immense. To geology, it is almost instantaneous. Entire mountain ranges can remain unchanged for far longer. Continents barely shift. Yet during this brief interval, the climate system accelerated into one of the fastest known natural warming events since the extinction of the dinosaurs. Evidence for the PETM appears everywhere scientists look. Ocean sediment cores recovered from distant parts of the world preserve the same distinctive carbon isotope signal. The chemical signature occurs in every major ocean basin. Rocks separated by thousands of kilometers tell the same story with remarkable consistency. The warming was not regional, it was planetary. As temperatures climbed, familiar climate zones expanded beyond their modern boundaries. Tropical and subtropical conditions spread toward higher latitudes. Fossil evidence from Arctic regions reveals forests growing where frozen landscapes exist today. Palm trees flourished far north of their modern range. Relatives of alligators inhabited environments that would now spend much of the year locked in snow and ice. The tropics themselves became hotter still. Ocean surface temperatures in some equatorial regions reached levels that many modern marine ecosystems would struggle to tolerate. Heat accumulated in places already warm, pushing biological systems toward thresholds rarely encountered in the present world. For ecosystems descended from the environments that produced Titanoboa, this created a paradox. Warmth had enabled gigantism. Stable heat had expanded the physiological limits of enormous ectothermic predators. Yet every biological advantage has an upper boundary. Beyond a certain point, rising temperatures cease to be beneficial and begin imposing new stresses on the organisms that once depended on them. Some climate models suggest parts of the tropical world may have experienced ecological disruption as temperatures approached extreme levels. The conditions that helped create giant snakes may eventually have moved beyond the range that even giant snakes preferred. The PETM did not last forever. Over millions of years, global temperatures gradually began to decline. The cooling was slow, almost imperceptible within any single generation, yet relentless across geological time. With that descent, the extraordinary world that had supported Titanoboa began to fade. The greatest warming event of the past 65 million years arrived after Titanoboa's rise. The long cooling that followed would ultimately erase the world that made such a creature possible. Extinction is often imagined as a moment, a flash in the sky, a wall of fire, a continent shaking beneath a volcanic horizon, yet some worlds disappear so gradually that no single generation witnesses the ending. The change arrives quietly, measured not in disasters but in temperatures drifting downward across immense spans of time. After the extraordinary warmth of the Paleocene and the later peak represented by the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, Earth entered a long cooling trend. The decline was not immediate. It unfolded over millions of years, almost invisible against the rhythm of individual lives. Rivers still flowed, forests still stood, rain still fell across northern South America. Yet the thermal foundation supporting the largest snake in Earth's history was slowly weakening. For Titanoboa, the first consequences would have appeared inside the body itself. Every movement, every heartbeat, every digestive process depended on environmental heat. A massive ectotherm survives only when the surrounding world supplies enough energy to keep its biological machinery operating efficiently. As average temperatures slipped lower, even by small amounts, digestion would have taken longer. Growth rates would have slowed, periods of activity would have shortened. Recovery after feeding would have required more time. In smaller animals, modest reductions in metabolic efficiency can be tolerated. Titanoboa existed at a vastly different scale. A body weighing more than a ton required continuous biological throughput simply to remain viable. Tiny losses in efficiency multiplied across thousands of kilograms of living tissue. What would have been negligible for a smaller snake became increasingly costly for a giant. The ecosystem surrounding it was changing as well. The giant fish, crocodilian relatives, and enormous turtles inhabiting the warm waterways of the Cerrejón Basin were themselves products of a hotter world. Their growth rates, reproductive success, and population sizes depended on the same environmental stability that Titanoboa required. As temperatures declined, community structure gradually shifted. Some species became less abundant, others grew smaller. Ecological relationships that had persisted for millions of years began reorganizing. Reproduction likely became another pressure point. Earlier generations of Titanoboa females had developed offspring within an environment of remarkable thermal consistency. Embryonic development, gestation timing, and juvenile survival all depended upon that stability. As temperatures drifted beyond the optimal range, developmental success would have become less predictable. Fewer young reaching maturity each generation can alter the fate of a species long before extinction becomes visible in the fossil record. The landscape itself slowly transformed. The permanently warm, flooded wetlands that once stretched across vast regions became less extensive. Waterways fragmented. Thermal refuges grew smaller and more isolated. Conditions that had once been widespread became increasingly localized. A species adapted to a narrow climatic window found that window steadily contracting. Meanwhile, other snakes faced fewer constraints. Smaller bodied species required less food, less heat, and less time to reach maturity. They could function efficiently under conditions that increasingly challenged a giant specialist. Evolution did not need to defeat Titanoboa directly. It only needed to favor animals better suited to the new reality. The last confirmed fossils of Titanoboa date to approximately 58 million years ago. After that, the record falls silent. There was no final battle, no dramatic collapse, no singular catastrophe. The species was not destroyed. It was gradually excluded by a planet becoming cooler, less predictable, and less accommodating to the immense biological demands that had once made its existence possible. Long before the first true cats stalked through forests, or the first wolves pursued prey across open ground, a quieter transition was already underway. It unfolded beneath the canopy of changing climates and shifting ecosystems, as one style of dominance slowly gave way to another. The survivors of the dinosaur extinction had begun as small creatures living in the margins. During the Paleocene, mammals remained relatively modest in size and ecological influence. They occupied niches that giant reptiles largely ignored, feeding on insects, fruits, seeds, and small animals, while the largest predators of the age still belonged to older lineages. Yet evolution rarely remains still when opportunities exist. As the Eocene epoch began, approximately 56 million years ago, mammalian diversity expanded dramatically. New forms appeared across multiple continents. Early primates moved through forests. Ancestral hoofed mammals diversified into a wide variety of body plans. Primitive, carnivorous groups, known as creodonts, spread into predatory roles. Distant relatives of the lineages that would eventually produce dogs, cats, bears, and many other familiar mammals began establishing themselves within ecosystems that had once belonged to reptiles. The difference between these emerging predators and Titanoboa was not intelligence, speed, or strength. It was heat. Titanoboa depended entirely upon environmental warmth. Every aspect of its biology was tied to the temperature of the world surrounding it. Mammals operated under a different system. They generated heat internally through metabolism. Their muscles remained active across a broader range of conditions. Their digestive systems continued functioning efficiently when temperatures dropped. Their activity patterns were no longer restricted by the thermal limitations that governed giant ectotherms. As global climates cooled, this distinction became increasingly important. The same environmental changes that gradually narrowed Titanoboa's physiological window had far less impact on warm blooded predators. A mammalian hunter could remain active during cooler mornings, cooler seasons, and within habitats that would challenge a giant tropical snake. What had once been a minor advantage slowly became a defining ecological strength. The transformation did not happen overnight. For millions of years, mammals and large reptiles shared landscapes shaped by the aftermath of the dinosaur extinction. Early mammalian predators were not immediately superior. In many cases, they were smaller, less specialized, and less dominant than the giant reptiles around them. What changed was the direction of the world itself. Cooling climates favored flexibility. Habitats became more varied. Environmental stability declined. Under those conditions, the ability to regulate internal temperature provided opportunities unavailable to animals dependent upon external heat sources. Mammals expanded into ecological roles that had previously been difficult to occupy. Their body sizes increased. Their diversity accelerated. Their influence spread across continents. The fossil record preserves this handover with remarkable clarity. Early Paleocene ecosystems often show large reptilian predators occupying the highest positions within food webs. By the later stages of the Paleocene and into the Eocene, mammalian carnivores increasingly appear in those same roles. Across roughly 10 million years, the balance shifted. What mammals inherited was not necessarily a richer world or an easier one. It was a cooler world, a world that increasingly rewarded internal heat over external warmth. Titanoboa's biology was never flawed. It was exquisitely adapted to a specific planetary moment. When that moment ended, another strategy rose to prominence. For more than 50 million years since, the dominant predators of Earth have largely been endotherms. Yet for a brief interval after the dinosaurs vanished, the greatest hunter in South America was a cold-blooded snake ruling warm rivers that no longer exist. Long after the bones were measured and the estimates published, a quieter question began circulating through the scientific literature. The discovery itself was not under dispute. Titanoboa existed. The fossils were real. The dimensions were supported by multiple specimens recovered from the same formation. What remained uncertain was whether the snake's immense size could truly be used as a reliable measure of ancient temperature. The debate appeared almost immediately. In the same year that the original study was published, several researchers challenged one of its central assumptions. Their concern was not with the length of the animal or the reconstruction of its body mass. Instead, they questioned whether a creature this large would follow the same thermal rules as smaller living snakes. The argument centered on a concept known as thermal inertia. Large objects change temperature more slowly than small ones. A sunlit boulder retains warmth long after sunset. A pebble cools much more quickly. The same principle applies to living organisms. At a mass exceeding 1,000 kilograms, Titanoboa may have possessed an extraordinary capacity to retain heat. Once warmed by its environment, its body could potentially remain stable for extended periods, reducing its dependence on constant ambient temperatures. If that interpretation is correct, then body size alone might exaggerate the temperature estimate derived from the paleothermometer model. Ancient tropical South America would still have been exceptionally warm, but perhaps not quite as warm as the original calculations suggested. Critics pointed to another example. Researchers examined the implications of applying similar scaling relationships to giant monitor lizards. The logic appeared to predict body sizes far beyond anything observed among living monitors. If the model could generate unrealistic outcomes in one reptile lineage, perhaps caution was necessary when applying it to another. This became known informally as the megalania problem, a reminder that biological systems are rarely governed by a single variable. At the same time, supporters of the original interpretation argued that temperature was only part of a much larger picture. They pointed toward the remarkable ecological circumstances of Paleocene South America. The continent was isolated. Large predatory niches remained unusually open after the extinction event. Prey was abundant. Competition was limited. Predation pressure on adult Titanoboas appears to have been essentially non existent. Under those conditions, natural selection consistently favored larger individuals. Each increase in body size brought advantages in feeding efficiency, survival, and reproductive success. The environment did not merely allow gigantism, it rewarded it generation after generation across millions of years. As more evidence accumulated, a middle position gradually emerged. Most researchers now view temperature as necessary, but not sufficient by itself. Extraordinary warmth created the physiological possibility. Ecological release created the opportunity. Continental isolation preserved the conditions. Directional selection supplied the evolutionary momentum. Together, these factors produced an animal unlike anything alive today. What makes the discussion so fascinating is that Titanoboa sits beyond the normal boundaries of comparison. There is no modern analog. No living snake approaches its mass. No living ecosystem reproduces its environmental conditions. Scientists are therefore forced to extend existing models into territory where direct testing becomes impossible. In that sense, the debate reveals something larger than the animal itself. Titanoboa occupies a place near the edge of scientific certainty, where evidence remains strong but interpretation becomes increasingly difficult. The question of what this snake says about ancient climate remains active because the same carbon driven processes that shaped Paleocene warmth are part of the story of the modern world as well. Beneath the machinery, conveyor belts, and terraced walls of northern Colombia's Cerrejón mine lies a landscape that once breathed. The fossils recovered there tell only part of the story. The rock surrounding them is equally important. Titanoboa was discovered within the remains of its own world, preserved not as skeletons alone, but as an entire ecosystem transformed by deep time. The coal extracted from Cerrejón began as a living Paleocene rainforest. Vast stands of vegetation grew in heat unlike anything found in modern tropical forests. Leaves fell into waterlogged ground. Trunks collapsed into slow-moving channels. Layer upon layer of plant material accumulated in oxygen-poor conditions where decay could not keep pace with growth. Over millions of years, burial, pressure, and heat compressed those organic remains into dense seams of carbon-rich coal. The result is remarkable. The mine is not merely a place where fossils happen to occur, it is the fossil. The rainforest itself became stone. The rivers, floodplains, and wetlands that supported giant lungfish, crocodilian relatives, enormous turtles, and Titanoboa were gradually converted into a geological archive of carbon. That carbon remained locked away for roughly 60 million years. Today, those ancient deposits are excavated and burned as fuel. What was once stored beneath layers of sediment is returned to the atmosphere through combustion. The process is measurable with extraordinary precision. Carbon atoms carry chemical signatures that reveal their origin. When fossil fuels burn, they release carbon that has been isolated since deep geological time. Atmospheric scientists can detect these isotope patterns directly in modern air samples, tracing ancient carbon as it re enters the active climate system. This connection links Titanoboa's world to our own in an unexpectedly direct way. The greenhouse climate that supported giant snakes did not emerge from chance. It was associated with elevated concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Warm oceans, humid forests, and exceptionally high global temperatures were all parts of the same planetary system. Later, over immense spans of time, geological processes slowly removed carbon from the atmosphere. Weathering, sediment burial, and long term carbon cycling gradually reduced greenhouse conditions. The world cooled. Ecosystems changed. The environmental framework that once supported Titanoboa disappeared. The coal of Cerrejón is part of that story. It represents carbon removed from circulation and stored underground during Earth's slow climatic evolution. Burning that coal reverses the process. Carbon that spent tens of millions of years beneath the surface is released back into the atmosphere in a geological instant. The contrast in timescales is striking. The warm climates of the Paleocene developed across millions of years, allowing ecosystems opportunities to migrate, adapt, and reorganize. Modern carbon release is occurring within centuries. In geological terms, that pace is extraordinarily rapid. For this reason, Titanoboa is more than an extinct animal preserved in stone. It occupies a position within a much larger narrative of climate, carbon, and planetary change. The giant snake, hidden within Cerrejón's coal seams, is not merely evidence of a vanished ecosystem. It is evidence that Earth has occupied dramatically warmer states before, and that the physical mechanisms capable of creating those conditions remain part of the same planet today. Among all the questions Titanoboa inspires, one appears more often than almost any other. If Earth continues warming, could conditions eventually return that allow a snake of similar size to evolve again? The answer is neither simple nor dramatic. It begins with temperature, but it does not end there. Modern tropical rainforests already occupy the warmest sustained terrestrial climates on the planet. Across much of the Amazon basin, mean annual temperatures generally range between roughly 25 and 27 degrees Celsius. These conditions support the largest living snakes known today, including green anacondas and reticulated pythons. Yet even these giants remain far smaller than Titanoboa. The calculations derived from Titanoboa's physiology suggest a minimum viable temperature range of approximately 30 to 34 degrees Celsius. That places its environment several degrees above even the hottest major rainforest systems currently operating on Earth. The difference may appear modest on paper, but biologically, it represents a profound shift in metabolic potential. Climate projections offer an interesting comparison. Under the highest emissions scenarios considered by major climate assessments, portions of the tropical world could experience warming of roughly 3 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Such increases begin to approach the lower boundary associated with Titanoboa's estimated thermal requirements. Even so, temperature alone would not recreate Titanoboa. The giant snake was the product of a unique convergence of circumstances. Warmth supplied the metabolic possibility. Ecological release supplied opportunity. Continental isolation limited competition. Abundant prey rewarded larger size. Millions of years of directional selection gradually pushed body mass upward generation after generation. Remove any of those elements, and the evolutionary pathway changes. This distinction matters because evolution does not operate like a switch. Raising temperature does not suddenly produce giant reptiles. Biological communities respond through countless small adjustments distributed across populations and timescales. Some of those adjustments are already observable. Studies of modern ectotherms have documented measurable responses to regional warming. Growth rates, activity patterns, geographic distributions, and body sizes can all shift as environmental temperatures change. The effects vary among species, but the underlying relationship between temperature and reptilian biology remains well established. The deeper significance of Titanoboa therefore lies elsewhere. Its existence demonstrates that Earth is capable of sustaining climates substantially warmer than those familiar to human civilization. The fossil record preserves direct evidence of a world where tropical ecosystems operated at temperatures beyond anything found today. In that world, a cold-blooded predator exceeding a ton in mass occupied the top of the food web in northern South America. No serious scientist is suggesting that enormous snakes will soon emerge from modern rivers. The evolutionary requirements are too specific, and the timescales far too long. What the evidence does suggest is that planetary climate possesses a wider operating range than human experience alone might imply. Titanoboa serves as a reminder of that range. Its bones preserve the record of environmental conditions that once existed and could, under different circumstances, exist again. The real lesson is not about giant snakes. It is about the extraordinary states a planet can enter when its thermostat moves, and about the long biological consequences that follow when it does. Some spans of time are too large to grasp directly. The mind can repeat the number, 60 million years, but the figure remains abstract, floating beyond ordinary experience. To understand it, the scale has to be approached indirectly, through comparisons small enough to hold and large enough to matter. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That may already feel immense when compared to a human lifetime. Yet, Titanoboa lived approximately 200 times farther back in time than the entire existence of our species. Every language ever spoken, every migration, every kingdom, every invention, every story told around a fire belongs to a period unimaginably closer to the present than Titanoboa does. A calendar offers another way of seeing the distance. Imagine compressing the entire 4.5 billion-year history of Earth into a single year. Oceans form in the early months, continents drift, life appears and slowly transforms the planet. Dinosaurs arrive late in the year and disappear only days before the end. Within that scale, Titanoboa enters the story around the 19th of December. Humans do not appear until the final minutes of the final day. The emergence of Homo sapiens occurs at approximately 11:37 in the evening on the 31st of December. Everything associated with recorded history occupies only the final moments before midnight. Agriculture, cities, writing, mathematics, philosophy, science, industry, and the modern world unfold in what amounts to the last few seconds before the calendar ends. Titanoboa itself persisted for roughly 2 million years. Compared to the duration of recorded civilization, that is an astonishing span. If the existence of Titanoboa were compressed into a normal working day, all of documented human history would occupy only the last handful of seconds before closing time. These comparisons reveal something deeper than chronology. The world inhabited by Titanoboa was not merely older than ours, it was configured differently. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations were different. Temperatures were different. Ocean circulation patterns were different. Forests occupied unfamiliar forms. Continents had not yet settled into their modern arrangements. Entire ecosystems operated according to environmental conditions with no true equivalent in the present day. And yet the planet itself was the same. The same laws of chemistry governed the atmosphere. The same relationship connected greenhouse gases and temperature. The same principles of evolution shaped living organisms. The same constraints of metabolism determined what bodies could become. Nothing fundamental had changed. Only the values within the system had shifted. That distinction matters because it places humanity in a broader context. The climate familiar to us is not the permanent condition of Earth, it is one state among many. The fossil record shows a planet capable of occupying dramatically different configurations while remaining governed by the same physical rules. Titanoboa stands as evidence of that reality. Its existence demonstrates how far those configurations can diverge from modern experience while still producing thriving ecosystems and successful forms of life. The giant snake belonged to a version of Earth almost impossible to imagine, yet entirely real. In that sense, Titanoboa is more than a fossil. It is a reminder that life continually explores the boundaries allowed by its environment, and that when the world changes, the possibilities available to living things change with it. A skeleton buried in coal can tell many stories. It can reveal size, habitat, diet, movement, and climate. Yet beneath all those discoveries lies a deeper lesson. Titanoboa is not merely the record holder among snakes. It is evidence that the limits of life are often less rigid than they appear. The basic snake body plan is ancient. For more than 100 million years, snakes have followed a remarkably consistent design. They are elongated predators with flexible skulls, reduced limbs, specialized vertebrae, and metabolisms tied closely to environmental temperature. Across vast spans of geological time, countless species have come and gone, yet the fundamental architecture has remained recognizably the same. Titanoboa did not require a new blueprint. It was built from the same anatomical framework seen in living boas, the same arrangement of vertebrae, the same muscular organization, the same developmental pathways guiding growth from embryo to adult. Nothing about its basic construction was revolutionary. What changed was scale. The largest living snakes rarely exceed a few hundred kilograms. Titanoboa reached masses measured in more than 1,000 kilograms. The increase was extraordinary, yet it emerged from a body plan that already existed. The design remained familiar, the environmental conditions changed. This distinction is important because it reshapes how biological limits are understood. Constraints often appear absolute when viewed only through the lens of the present. A modern observer might assume there is a fixed maximum size for a snake, just as there is a fixed range for a forest, a river system, or an ecosystem. The fossil record repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. What appears impossible under one set of conditions may become entirely viable under another. Evolutionary biologists sometimes describe this idea as possibility space. At any moment in Earth's history, every lineage exists within a range of potential forms permitted by temperature, food availability, competition, predation, and physical law. Those boundaries are real, but they are not static. They expand and contract as environments change. During the Paleocene, several of those boundaries shifted simultaneously. Sustained warmth elevated metabolic limits. Prey was abundant. Large predatory competitors were absent. Continental isolation reduced ecological interference. Together, these factors opened an unusually large region of possibility space for a giant snake lineage to explore. Titanoboa expanded into that opening. Later, the boundaries moved again. Temperatures declined, ecosystems reorganized, mammalian predators diversified. The environmental framework that had permitted extreme gigantism gradually narrowed. The space available to Titanoboa disappeared, and with it the evolutionary pathway that had produced the animal. Yet the underlying blueprint remained. Modern snakes still carry developmental systems descended from ancient ancestors. The genetic and physiological foundations that once supported extraordinary size have not vanished entirely. What has vanished is the world that allowed those traits to be expressed on such a scale. That realization extends beyond reptiles. Every organism alive today exists within the environmental limits of the present moment. Humans, forests, oceans, insects, and mammals all occupy forms shaped by current conditions rather than permanent rules. Titanoboa reminds us that the creatures inhabiting Earth today are not necessarily the only creatures the planet can produce. They are simply the forms permitted by the particular configuration of climate, ecology, and opportunity that exists right now. Change the configuration, and the range of possibilities changes with it. Long before Titanoboa appeared in the rivers of Paleocene South America, the lineage that would eventually produce it had already survived disasters almost beyond comprehension. Across more than 100 million years of Earth history, snakes endured repeated episodes of ecological upheaval that erased countless other groups. Continents shifted, climates transformed, entire ecosystems vanished. Through each transition, snakes persisted. Their survival was not a consequence of dominance, it emerged from flexibility. A study published in Nature Communications during 2021 examined the effects of the end Cretaceous extinction on snake diversity. The results showed that the catastrophe was devastating. Most snake lineages disappeared at the boundary. Diversity collapsed alongside the dinosaurs and many other groups. Yet a handful of lineages survived, and the traits shared by those survivors reveal something important about how extinction works. The snakes that endured were generally small. They required little food. Many could shelter underground or within protected habitats. Most importantly, they were dietary generalists, capable of feeding on a wide range of prey rather than depending on a single ecological resource. These characteristics became invaluable after the asteroid impact. The years that followed were marked by darkness, cooling, and widespread ecological disruption. Food webs broke apart, plant productivity declined, entire communities disappeared. Large animals with high energetic demands often struggled to survive. Small snakes, by contrast, possessed a remarkable physiological advantage. They could wait. The fasting capacity of snakes remains one of the most extraordinary adaptations in the animal kingdom. Some modern species can survive for months or even years with little or no food. During these periods, the body enters a carefully regulated state of metabolic suppression. Heart rate slows, digestive organs shrink, energy expenditure falls dramatically. Rather than consuming themselves through uncontrolled starvation, snakes reduce biological activity to the minimum required for survival. In effect, they become specialists in enduring scarcity. What appears to be a limitation from one perspective becomes an advantage from another. Warm-blooded predators maintain constant internal temperatures and high activity levels, but those abilities require continuous energy intake. Snakes operate according to a different strategy. Their dependence on environmental heat allows them to function with far lower energetic demands. During stable times, that physiology may seem restrictive. During planetary crises, it can become a lifeline. The same biological framework that allowed ancient snakes to survive mass extinction eventually made Titanoboa possible. Its immense size was built upon an ectothermic foundation refined through tens of millions of years of persistence. The metabolic dependence on warmth that later enabled gigantism was inherited from ancestors whose greatest achievement was simply remaining alive when so much else disappeared. Today, that lineage remains one of the most successful on Earth. More than 3,700 snake species inhabit nearly every major landmass except Antarctica. They occupy deserts, forests, wetlands, mountains, grasslands, rivers, and oceans. They range from tiny burrowing specialists to large marine hunters. Few vertebrate groups have demonstrated such ecological versatility across such a vast span of time. Titanoboa itself vanished long ago, carried away by changes in climate and ecology. Yet the lineage that produced it continues to thrive. The capacity for adaptation remains. The potential remains. What has changed is the world around it. The planet that once permitted a 1-ton river snake no longer exists, and until conditions shift again, neither will anything quite like Titanoboa. Some discoveries become larger with every new fossil unearthed, others remain surrounded by absence. Titanoboa belongs to the second category. For all the attention it has received, for all the reconstructions, measurements, and scientific papers, the entire known record of this animal comes from a remarkably small place in both geography and geology. 28 individuals recovered from a single formation in northern Colombia. No confirmed Titanoboa fossils have been identified anywhere else on Earth. That fact is easy to overlook. The animal itself is so immense that it seems as though it should have left traces across continents. Yet the evidence remains concentrated within one corner of the ancient world, preserved inside rocks formed in a tropical basin that existed shortly after the extinction of the dinosaurs. One possibility is that Titanoboa truly was restricted to this environment. The Sarajone Basin may have offered a combination of temperature, humidity, prey abundance, and hydrological stability found nowhere else. If that were the case, the giant snake was not merely adapted to warmth, it was adapted to a very particular warmth within a very specific ecological setting. Its range may have been surprisingly narrow despite its enormous size. Another possibility is simpler. The fossil record is incomplete. Early Paleocene tropical deposits are rare. Tropical environments are not ideal archives of deep time. Warm temperatures, abundant rainfall, active soils, and dense biological activity tend to destroy remains long before they can fossilize. Even when fossils are preserved, they are often buried beneath younger sediments and remain inaccessible. The conditions that protected Sarajevo's ancient ecosystem were unusual enough that comparable deposits may exist elsewhere without having been recognized or studied. Sarajón itself owes much of its scientific importance to a coincidence of geology and industry. The same processes that transformed an ancient rainforest into coal also created conditions capable of preserving bones, leaves, pollen, and traces of an entire vanished ecosystem. Mining operations later exposed those layers. Without excavation for coal, many of the fossils might never have been seen. Yet the mine introduces another reality. The fossil-bearing formation is finite. Every year, additional material is removed. New discoveries continue to emerge, but the archive is slowly consumed as it is uncovered. Each specimen collected represents information rescued from a resource that cannot regenerate. The opportunity to study this window into the Paleocene exists only for as long as the rock itself remains available. What has already been recovered is extraordinary. Sierra preserves the oldest known neotropical rainforest and the most complete early Paleocene vertebrate community yet documented in the Western Hemisphere. It offers an entire food web from a chapter of Earth history that is otherwise dimly illuminated. And the path to that revelation began almost accidentally, with researchers studying fossil plants rather than searching for giant snakes. Perhaps that is what gives Titanoboa such an unusual presence in the scientific imagination, not merely its size, but its solitude. An immense predator, ruler of a vanished ecosystem, known from a few dozen fossils in one Colombian coal mine, an entire rain compressed into fragments of bone and stone. The silence surrounding those remains is part of the story. Beyond the measured vertebrae and reconstructed skeletons lies a reminder of how little survives. Whole worlds can flourish for millions of years, leave only scattered traces behind, and then recede so completely that their existence must be pieced together from a handful of discoveries made by chance. Dominance in nature often appears permanent while it lasts. An apex predator occupies the highest position in a food web, shapes the behavior of other species, and moves through its environment with few meaningful threats. Yet the fossil record tells a quieter story. No apex predator remains at the top forever. Each one belongs to a particular chapter of planetary history written by conditions that eventually change. Titanoboa occupied such a chapter. For approximately 2 million years, it stood at the summit of its ecosystem. Adult individuals likely had no natural predators. Few animals were large enough to threaten them, and none appear capable of consistently competing for the same ecological role. The warm rivers and flooded forests of Paleocene Colombia provided an environment almost perfectly aligned with the biological requirements of a giant ectothermic hunter. Its dominance was real, but it was also conditional. The same pattern appears repeatedly across deep time. During the late Cretaceous, gigantic theropod dinosaurs occupied the role of terrestrial apex predators. Among them, Tyrannosaurus rex emerged as one of the most formidable. Its immense skull, powerful bite, and large body were suited to a world rich in enormous herbivorous prey. In the oceans millions of years later, Megalodon became dominant under a different set of circumstances. Warm seas and abundant marine mammals created opportunities for a predator of extraordinary size and power. Titanoboa belongs within that lineage of ecological giants. What links these animals is not anatomy. One was a dinosaur, one a shark, one a snake. Their bodies followed entirely different evolutionary pathways. What they shared was a match between biology and environment. Each occupied a window of opportunity created by the specific climate, geography, prey communities, and ecological relationships of its time. When those conditions shifted, the advantage disappeared. This pattern is so common that it begins to resemble a fundamental rule. Apex predators are not universal champions. They are temporary expressions of particular environmental circumstances. Change the circumstances enough, and the qualities that once produced dominance can become liabilities. The cooling that followed Titanoboa's age illustrates this clearly. Its immense body depended on sustained warmth, abundant prey, and stable aquatic habitats. As those conditions weakened, the biological traits that once made gigantism advantageous became increasingly costly. Smaller animals, with different strategies, gained an advantage. The apex position changed hands. Seen from this wider perspective, Titanoboa becomes more than a remarkable snake. It becomes a reminder that ecosystems are dynamic systems rather than fixed hierarchies. The dominant species of one era may be impossible in another. That lesson extends beyond ancient rivers and vanished rainforests. Every living organism exists within environmental boundaries that define what is possible. Modern ecosystems, like ancient ones, are shaped by climate, resource availability, competition, and geography. The predators that dominate today do so because present conditions permit them to. Even humanity exists within such a framework. Our species rose during a comparatively stable interval of Earth history. The climates, coastlines, ecosystems, and seasonal patterns familiar to civilization are not permanent features of the planet. They represent one configuration among many. Titanoboa's story reflects that reality with unusual clarity. It did not become the apex predator because it was destined to do so. It became the apex because its world rewarded exactly the traits it possessed. For a brief span of geological time, snake and environment fit together perfectly. When that alignment ended, the rain ended with it. Return, for a moment, to the place where the story began. The Cerrejón mine stretches across northern Colombia as a landscape of exposed rock, machinery, and excavation. Beneath its surface lie the remains of an ancient rainforest, compressed by pressure and time into thick seams of coal. It was within those layers that Titanoboa was discovered. Yet, after everything we have learned about the animal, its climate, and its vanished ecosystem, the coal itself begins to look different. It is no longer merely the setting of the discovery, it is the discovery. The coal being extracted from Cerrejón is composed of the fossilized remains of the world Titanoboa inhabited. The trees, ferns, aquatic vegetation, and countless other organisms that grew across that Paleocene landscape captured carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. They built leaves, stems, roots, and trunks from that carbon. When those organisms died, portions of their remains accumulated in waterlogged environments where decomposition remained incomplete. Over immense spans of time, those organic deposits were buried, compressed, and transformed. The result is the carbon-rich rock mined today. Every ton of coal contains fragments of that ancient ecosystem. The connection is not symbolic, it is chemical. The carbon stored inside those rocks was removed from the atmosphere approximately 60 million years ago. It remained isolated through the rise and fall of continents, through evolutionary radiations and extinctions, through climatic transitions that reshaped the planet. While mammals diversified, while oceans changed, while humanity eventually emerged, that carbon remained locked underground. Then it was excavated. When coal burns, the stored carbon combines with oxygen and enters the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Scientists can identify this ancient carbon directly. Fossil fuels possess distinctive isotope signatures that differ from those found in recently living organisms. Measurements taken from the modern atmosphere clearly reveal the growing contribution of carbon released from geological reservoirs. The source is not hidden. The chemistry records it. That connection carries an unusual significance in the case of Cerrejón. The greenhouse conditions that helped make Titanoboa possible existed in a world with elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. Over tens of millions of years, geological processes gradually reduced those concentrations. Weathering, sediment, burial, and other mechanisms slowly drew carbon from the atmosphere and stored it within rocks and sediments. The cooling that followed transformed the planet. Ecosystems changed, giant ectothermic predators disappeared, new biological opportunities emerged. Eventually, conditions developed that would allow human civilization to flourish. The carbon now being released represents part of that ancient drawdown operating in reverse. The contrast lies in the timescale. Geological processes required millions of years to remove vast quantities of atmospheric carbon. Human industry has begun returning portions of it within centuries. The difference between those rates is difficult to fully comprehend. One unfolds across epochs, the other fits comfortably within recorded history. Titanoboa is often remembered as a giant snake, and understandably so, yet the bones alone are only part of the story. The animal existed within a complete planetary system of climate, vegetation, atmosphere, and energy flow. The coal beneath Sarajevo preserves that system in physical form. That is the deeper weight carried by the discovery. Not merely that an enormous predator once lived there, but that the rocks surrounding its fossils contain the remains of the world that created it. And when those rocks burn, fragments of that ancient world return to the sky once again. Stand beside any fossil long enough, and a peculiar sensation begins to emerge. Not wonder in the ordinary sense, and not merely curiosity. Something quieter, a recognition that the world has been many worlds before it became this one. Deep time is often described through numbers: millions of years, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. Yet numbers alone rarely communicate what those spans actually represent. The deeper lesson arrives when the imagination begins to treat those intervals not as measurements, but as lived realities. Entire planetary conditions existed for durations so vast that they dwarf every human institution, every culture, every memory, and every story ever recorded. The Earth is old enough to have reinvented itself repeatedly. The continents have gathered and separated. Coastlines have appeared and vanished. Oceans have changed their chemistry. Atmospheric composition has risen and fallen. Forests have spread across regions that are now deserts. Ice has covered places that are now densely populated. Again and again, the planet has shifted into new configurations, each one stable enough for life to adapt to, flourish within, and eventually take for granted. The Paleocene world belonged to one of those configurations. For Titanoboa, the immense warmth of the tropics was not remarkable. The flooded forests, the heavy atmosphere, the vast river systems, and the biological communities supported by them were simply the background conditions of existence. Nothing about that world would have felt extraordinary to the creatures living inside it. It was home, it was normal, it was reality itself. That perspective is not unique to Titanoboa. Humans experience the modern world through the same lens. The climates we call ordinary are the climates that shaped our civilization. The ecosystems we treat as familiar are those inherited from the relatively recent past. The seasonal patterns, agricultural systems, coastlines, and biological communities around us feel permanent, largely because they have remained recognizable throughout the span of recorded history. The fossil record offers a gentle correction to that assumption. Every ecological arrangement appears stable when viewed from within. Every dominant species tends to regard its circumstances as the natural order of things, yet layer after layer of stone reveals the same recurring truth. Stability exists, sometimes for immense periods, but permanence does not. Conditions persist, then drift. Worlds endure, then transform. The lesson is not one of catastrophe. Earth has survived events far more dramatic than anything humanity has witnessed. Continents will continue moving. Oceans will continue circulating. Life will continue adapting. The planet itself is not fragile. What changes is the specific configuration. The combination of temperatures, ecosystems, atmospheric conditions, and biological relationships that allows one group of organisms to thrive may not favor another. Titanoboa did not disappear because the Earth ended. It disappeared because the world it was exquisitely adapted to gradually became something else. That possibility extends beyond any single species. The conditions that support human civilization are not universal defaults written into the fabric of the planet. They are a particular arrangement, existing within a much larger range of possibilities Earth has expressed before. Deep time reveals that truth with unusual clarity. A world does not need to be destroyed to become unfamiliar. It only needs to change enough that the rules of living within it become different from the ones that came before. Among all the measurements, models, and reconstructions, one uncertainty remains untouched by every fossil discovery. It waits quietly beneath the statistics, beyond the vertebrae, beyond the temperature estimates and ecological diagrams. It concerns not what Titanoboa looked like, nor how large it became, but something far more elusive. What was it like to be Titanoboa? Science has carried us remarkably far. We can estimate body mass from bone dimensions. We can infer hunting strategies from skull anatomy. We can reconstruct ancient climates from chemistry preserved in stone. We can trace evolutionary relationships through comparative anatomy and genetics. From scattered fragments buried for tens of millions of years, an astonishing amount of information can be recovered. Yet there is a boundary beyond which fossils cannot easily follow. We know Titanoboa possessed a nervous system capable of navigating its environment, locating prey, reproducing, and responding to changing conditions. We know it interpreted chemical signals carried through water and air. We know it distinguished food from danger, opportunity from emptiness, warmth from cold. Those abilities were necessary for survival. Without them, the lineage could never have persisted. What remains hidden is the nature of the experience behind those processes. Did the world exist for Titanoboa as anything more than an ongoing flow of sensory information and instinctive responses? Did one individual register the presence of another beyond competition or reproduction? Did a massive snake resting beneath the surface of a Paleocene river possess any internal awareness resembling what humans would recognize as experience? The fossil record offers no direct answer. This is not a failure unique to Titanoboa. It is a challenge that extends across the history of life. The problem of consciousness remains unresolved, even among living animals. Researchers can examine brains, observe behavior, and measure neural activity. Yet the subjective nature of experience remains difficult to access. When dealing with extinct organisms, separated from us by 60 million years, the uncertainty becomes even greater. Bone preserves structure, it does not preserve perception. Still, one conclusion remains unavoidable. Titanoboa was not merely an object within its ecosystem, it was an active participant in it. For approximately 2 million years, countless individuals moved through rivers, consumed prey, reproduced, and altered the lives of other organisms around them. Crocodilians adapted in landscapes where giant snakes existed. Fish populations lived under their influence. Small mammals inherited environments shaped in part by their presence. Every ecosystem is a network of living relationships, and Titanoboa occupied one of the most influential positions within that network. Its existence changed outcomes. It redirected energy through food webs. It affected which individuals survived and which did not. Long before any human would walk the earth, its life was already intertwined with the lives of thousands of other species. That reality may be the closest science can come to answering the question, The inner world of Titanoboa remains beyond reach. Its effects do not. They persist in fossils, in ecosystems that followed, and in the traces left behind by a creature that was undeniably alive. Perhaps that is the only permanence any organism ever truly achieves. Not the preservation of the self, but the alteration of the world that remains after it is gone. A story that spans 60 million years can be traced back to something surprisingly small. Not a complete skeleton, not a dramatic skull emerging from stone, not a perfectly preserved animal frozen in time. A single vertebra. When that fossil first appeared on a workbench in Colombia, it did not announce itself as belonging to the largest snake known to science. It looked familiar enough to be mistaken for something else. The bone carried no label. It offered no explanation. For millions upon millions of years, it had remained buried in silence, waiting for someone to notice that it did not quite fit. That waiting is part of the story. The animal that produced the vertebra vanished long before humans existed. The climate that sustained it disappeared. The rivers shifted. The rainforest died and was buried beneath layers of sediment. Pressure accumulated slowly across geological ages. Organic matter transformed into coal. Continents continued moving through time. Entire evolutionary lineages appeared and disappeared while the fossil remained hidden underground. Yet the bone endured. It survived the cooling that ended Titanoboa's reign. It survived the compression of an ancient ecosystem into carbon-rich rock. It survived burial, uplift, and erosion. It remained intact through changes so vast that they exceed ordinary imagination. The vertebra outlasted not only the animal itself, but also the world that animal inhabited. Its rediscovery happened because humans were excavating the compressed remains of that lost world. Coal mining exposed layers that otherwise might have remained inaccessible for thousands or even millions of additional years. Within those layers rested fragments of a vanished ecosystem. Plants, fish, crocodilian relatives, turtles, and eventually the bones of a giant snake emerged from darkness together. The mine was not searching for Titanoboa. The discovery arrived as an unexpected consequence of looking for something else. From that moment, an extraordinary chain of understanding began to unfold. Researchers reconstructed body size from vertebrae. They inferred climate from anatomy. They connected fossil animals to fossil plants. They rebuilt food webs, habitats, and environmental conditions. Temperature estimates, ecological models, evolutionary explanations, and paleoclimate reconstructions all grew outward from evidence that initially occupied only a small space in a laboratory. An entire lost world gradually reassembled itself around a single clue. That process also reveals something important about the nature of knowledge itself. The fossil record is not a complete archive of Earth history. It is fragmented, selective, and shaped by chance. Most organisms leave no trace. Most ecosystems disappear without preservation. Even when fossils form, they must survive burial, chemistry, tectonic activity, erosion, and discovery. What reaches us represents only a tiny fraction of everything that once lived. Titanoboa is therefore significant for more than its size. If the largest snake in Earth's history remained unknown until 2009, discovered because a student recognized an unusual fossil in a coal mine, then the gaps in our understanding are not minor details waiting to be filled. They are immense spaces stretching beyond the edges of current knowledge. Every conclusion drawn from Serhon stands on a small island of evidence surrounded by a vast sea of absence. Titanoboa is remarkable not only because it was found, but because it reminds us how much of Earth's history remains hidden from view. The story grows quieter here, not because there is less to say, but because the distance between then and now has become easier to feel than to measure. The Cerrejón Basin still exists in northern Colombia. Maps still mark its location. Trucks move across its surface. Machinery cuts through layers of earth that accumulated across spans of time almost beyond comprehension. Yet the landscape visible today is not the landscape that once sustained Titanoboa. The rivers follow different courses. The vegetation belongs to a different ecological age. The atmosphere carries a different balance of gases. Even the temperature, altered by only a handful of degrees compared with that ancient world, belongs to another biological reality. Those few degrees matter. They separate a planet capable of supporting a 1-ton snake from a planet that cannot. They separate an ecosystem shaped by giant ectothermic predators from one governed by very different rules. The difference appears modest on a thermometer. Across evolutionary timescales, it becomes profound. Beneath the ground lies the record of that difference. The coal extracted from Cerrejón is more than fuel. It is the compressed residue of vanished forests, buried floodplains, fallen leaves, ancient trunks, and forgotten seasons. It is the physical remainder of an environment that once stretched across the basin when Titanoboa moved through its waterways. Layer by layer, that record is being removed, converted into energy, released back into circulation, dispersed into the atmosphere from which it was originally drawn millions of years ago. What remains behind grows smaller with every passing year. The fossils already recovered are safe. They rest in collections, laboratories, museums, and scientific papers. Measurements have been taken. Analyses have been published. The knowledge has entered the human record. Yet the geological archive itself is finite. Unlike the data derived from it, the original source cannot be replaced. Somewhere within the remaining deposits, other discoveries almost certainly wait. Additional individuals may still lie buried. Fragments of skulls, bones from species never described, evidence capable of answering questions that remain unresolved. Entire branches of an ecosystem may still be hidden in stone. Whether those fossils will be uncovered before the formation is exhausted is impossible to know. That uncertainty lends the site a peculiar stillness, not because nothing remains to be discovered, but because so much does. Titanoboa itself is long gone. The lineage ended. The particular combination of traits that allowed it to dominate its environment disappeared with the conditions that produced it. For approximately 58 million years, other organisms have occupied the ecological spaces left behind. Evolution moved onward. The world continued changing. Yet the fact of its existence remains. The Earth was once capable of producing something like Titanoboa. The limits we assume are fixed, proved flexible under different circumstances. Heat, time, abundance, and opportunity combined to create an animal that now seems almost unreal, despite being entirely real. Perhaps that is what finally settles here. Not a conclusion, not a lesson neatly wrapped, only the accumulated weight of evidence, resting where the story began, deep beneath the surface, waiting in the darkness of stone. Imagine a river that no longer exists, not merely a river whose course has changed, but a river belonging to a world erased so completely that almost every trace of it has vanished. The water moves slowly beneath a canopy, unlike any forest alive today. Heat lingers in the air through every hour of darkness. Moisture hangs motionless between trunks and leaves. The landscape feels familiar only in the broadest sense. Every detail belongs to another version of Earth. The water is dark, not from depth, but from life. Leaves fall into channels and floodplains. Organic matter accumulates and dissolves. Tannins stain the current until it carries the color of strong tea beneath the forest shade. Reflections drift across the surface. Insects move through the humid air. Calls echo from animals whose descendants may never reach the modern age. The night unfolds according to rules long forgotten. There are no people, no roads, no distant lights on the horizon, no witness capable of understanding the place. The continent exists in relative isolation. Mammals remain small presences within the broader ecological tapestry. The conditions that shaped this world have aligned in a rare combination of warmth, stability, abundance, and time. Within those conditions, something extraordinary has emerged. Far below the surface, a long body passes through the darkness. Not rapidly, not with urgency. The movement is measured and economical. Water parts around muscle and scale. The animal spends no energy it does not need to spend. The environment asks nothing difficult of it. Temperatures remain high. Food is plentiful. The ecosystem supports its existence completely. By every biological measure available, the world is exactly what it requires. That creature does not know it occupies a record that will endure for tens of millions of years. It does not know future scientists will calculate its mass, debate its physiology, reconstruct its climate, and compare its dimensions with every giant snake discovered afterward. It does not know that fragments of its world will one day be compressed into coal and carried away by machines. None of those futures exist from its perspective. There is only the river, only the warmth stored in water and air, only the faint chemical traces drifting through the current, only the ancient rhythms of hunting, resting, growing, and surviving. The immense span of history ahead remains invisible. The cooling already beginning elsewhere on the planet remains imperceptible. The eventual disappearance of its lineage has not yet entered the story. Existence unfolds one moment at a time, and so the animal continues forward through a world that seems permanent. The forests seem permanent. The climate seems permanent. The river seems permanent. Yet everything changes. The warmth fades. The ecosystem transforms. New organisms inherit opportunities created by those changes. Continents continue their slow migrations. Entire communities disappear. Millions of years pass. The dark river vanishes. Only fragments remain, a few bones, a few layers of stone, a handful of clues preserved against overwhelming odds, enough to reveal that this world was real, enough to remind us that Earth has been many different places before, and somewhere within that vanished darkness, moving through warm water beneath an ancient canopy, the largest snake in history glides silently toward another dawn, unaware that it will one day become a memory carried across 60 million years.